I was very pleased to be invited to this symposium, mostly because I'm always very, very thrilled to share information about Frank Waters, who I think is one of the finest writers of the 20th century. But also, I am a poet, I am a professor, and my students think I'm a provocateur, so this is perfect. By embracing the full storytelling and archetypal potential of the American Southwest, Frank Waters wrote some of the finest literature of the 20th century, work that is distinct in style, voice, and thematic concerns. Born in 1902 here in the Springs, he began his 28-book career in 1930 with a visionary novel entitled The Lizard Woman, and would go on to write across nearly 7 decades many classics of fiction and nonfiction, almost 30 books, including Midas of the Rockies, People of the Valley, The Man Who Killed the Deer, Book of the Hopi, Pikes Peak, and Mountain Dialogues. In his writings, Frank Waters was fiercely loyal to the American Southwest and Mexico, arguing that this territory is the true heartland of American culture. His Southwestern vision came from an intimate and extensive experience. He engineered the first phone lines across the Mojave Desert. He journeyed by horseback across the Sierra Madres of Mexico. He edited a bilingual newspaper in Taos. He witnessed dozens of atomic detonations in Nevada as an information officer for the Atomic Energy Commission. And he lived with the Hopi Indians of Arizona while working on Book of the Hopi. Yet, wherever he lived and wrote in the American Southwest and Mexico, Frank Waters' lodestone, the core of his being, was right here in Colorado Springs and in the mountain that looms over it. Frank Waters writes in his book, The Colorado, "Next time, by hook or by crook, make sure you're born with a mountain in the front yard. It comes in mighty handy all the way around. When you're no bigger than that, you can hang on to the grimy window curtain and watch it hour after hour. Then you know it best with all its moods and mutations, its sternness, dignity, and immeasurable depth. It is like the face of an old medicine man, which only a child can understand. Other times, it's just a grand spectacle of a thing, a whole show in itself." In the shadow of Pikes Peak, influenced by his grandfather's philosophical explorations and his father's American Indian heritage, Waters formed a dualistic worldview that balanced social conflict with universal interconnection, scientific rationalism with transcendental mysticism. And it all began on 435 East Bijou Street. On July 25th, 1902, when Frank Waters was born, Colorado Springs was barely 3 decades old. While the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples had been removed to reservations, tribal bands still made an annual pilgrimage to the sacred waters of Manitou Springs. Meanwhile, up in the mountain, Cripple Creek was an active mining district, and the prairies to the east were still unbounded rangelands. Thus, the young Frank Waters grew up in a city surrounded by the tropes of a frontier era. Combining Southern agrarian, Northern Yankee, and American Indian ancestry, Frank Waters, in his birth, combined opposing qualities, a central theme in his writings. His father, Frank Jonathan Waters, had an Anglo-American and American Indian root, stretching back to northern Pennsylvania, while his mother, May Ione Dozier, was only 1 generation distant from the plantations of the Old South. In 1890, Frank Jonathan left Goodland, Kansas, moved to Colorado Springs. It was a city on the verge of an incredible transformation. A year after he arrived, Robert Bob Womack was prospecting near his former Cripple Creek homestead when he discovered a granite outcrop with a half-inch crack bisecting a discolored band. This was the famous El Paso lode, which would be the start of the second, and this time very real, Pikes Peak gold rush. Frank Jonathan at first was unaffected by these discoveries, and he continued living a modest, non-adventurous life as a financial clerk. In 1894, he became a boarder in the home of Joseph Dozier, migrant from the Deep South and one of Colorado Springs' best-known builders. Dozier had a crowded household which included his wife, 6 daughters, a son, and his father. Still, there was a place for Frank Jonathan since Dozier had built for his family a tall, ungainly house with 3 stories and lots of rooms. The house stood near Shook's Run, small cottonwood-lined stream that divided the city's eastern edge from the prairie and gave its name to the largely working-class neighborhood. While living there, Frank Jonathan drew the attention of Joseph's eldest daughter, May Ione, and the two became married on May 7th, 1901. They moved to a house on 229 North El Paso, just mere blocks away. But a year later, when May was about to give birth to Frank, she wanted to be in the comfort of her old home. So she went the few blocks to the old homestead and gave birth to Frank Waters in Joseph Dozier's house. Now, at the time of Frank's birth, the Dozier fortunes had been in decline for several years. Dozier was a hard-working builder, very honest, very exacting in his work and designs, and he built many important buildings in the city: Cutler Hall at Colorado College, the Congregational Church, the Colorado Gazette building, the Midland Block, the original post office, a dozen small office buildings, numerous homes, and Frank Waters claimed Nikola Tesla's lab. I haven't been able to nail that down. And in Pikes Peak, Frank's autobiographical trilogy, the fictional version of Joseph Dozier possessed over $1 million in assets. And he may have actually attained that dizzy height. But the gold rush got rid of that. So a few years after the Cripple Creek Bonanza, Joseph Dozier, who'd been resisting this for years, bought 3 mines: the Gramer, the Kruger, and the Hallelujah, all of which were unproductive. And the millions in assets went down a very deep hole on Pikes Peak. At first, the decline of the Dozier fortune didn't really affect Frank Waters. As he was growing up, he had an idyllic childhood. He played in Shook's Run, there it is. And he used to go ice skating on it, and he used to watch the trains come slamming down the Santa Fe Railroad line, which ran near his house. There were weekly dishes of ice cream at the drugstore downtown. Every day he'd walk to the red brick Columbia School a few blocks away on Boulder Street. Every Sunday he rode with his sister in a wagon pulled by his father to the Southern Methodist Church. And lots of reading. He did lots of reading as a child. So it was a quite idyllic childhood. And here's this came out kind of blurry. So sorry, but that's Colorado Springs in 1925. So it's a little late for this, but it gives you a good sense. So beyond these everyday adventures, right, there were a couple of very special events, moments that happened to him as a child that would shape his literary vision. One of these occurred up on Pikes Peak, up in Victor, and at his grandfather's mine. And he was poking around with the rocks on the slag pile, and he had this vision that was the origin of his transcendentalist worldview. The Colorado Waters describes this. Then suddenly it happened, the boy did not know how, all this dead stone became intensely, vibrantly alive. In the bright sunlight, he saw with microscopic clarity the infinitesimal shapes and colors, the monstrous and miraculous complexity of that single thimbleful of sand. In that instant, the world about him took on a new, great, and terrifying meaning. Every stone, every enormous boulder fitted into a close-knit unity similar to the one in his sweaty palm. It was as if in one instant the whole mountain had become alive and known. Waters' introduction to American Indian culture, which would become a central subject of his writing, there was his father's influence, but it really became sharply a part of his life with this event. His father took him to one of the annual Shan-Kive Ute festivals, which were, this one was a poster from 1913. And after the festival, Frank's father took him to the encampment, and this left a strong impression on the boy's memory. Waters would later say this memory stayed with him, his whole life. And it's described here in Below Grass Roots. The tall, conical teepees began to loom up in the darkness. Holding on to his father's hand, he walked slowly up the long lane. Dark, taciturn faces leapt at him in the glow of fires, their blanketed bodies huddled together in somber groups. Teepees flaps yawned open into the appalling blackness within. A shoulder of meat was lashed in the tree above, wondering for an instant if it were a body. He grasped his father's hand more closely. Tragically, Frank's childhood idyll came to an end in 1914 when his father died of pneumonia. And the death was a major, major blow to the family. They left, Frank and his sister and his mother left the home in El Paso, on El Paso, and moved back in with the Doziers, right, on Bijou Street. And by this point, Joseph Dozier's business had just completely vanished, between competition and the 1893 Depression and losing all his assets in the mines. Frank, as a middle school student, supported the family. And he did this by being first a newspaper seller at the Santa Fe Depot in Colorado Springs. Later, he would become a red cap. And he was a red cap at that station right up into college. And he really did support the family. I mean, they were living on Frank's meager earnings. During high school, he wasn't that great of a student. He was a B student. He really did like his English teacher, something I'd like to note, R.J. Wattles, who read these letters from her sister from the Navajo Reservation, and the geology professor, Alan Kite, who brought them up to Austin Bluffs, and they dug for shark's teeth, and this really gave him a sense of geological time. But he felt quite alienated from the city. He was sharply aware of his family's poverty, the class tensions of the city, and he always felt like an outsider. Even in college, here's Cutler Hall, which his grandfather built. In college, he was an engineering major. He didn't do that great. He had a C average when he dropped out at the end of his junior year. In Pikes Peak, he describes it was a spring day, beautiful spring day, May of his junior year, and he had a exam. He had to do it in a blue book, and he just turned in a blank blue book and left it. I was teaching The Dust Within the Rock, which is the third book of the trilogy, and I had a student. I had a blue book exam on the novel, and a student turned in a blue book exam, and all it had in there. Okay, thank you. All it had in there was, I've been inspired by The Dust Within the Rock. I'm dropping out of college. I'm going to be a ski bum. Thank you very much for teaching this book. And I thought, God, don't tell your parents, please, you know. So, dropping out of the engineering program, he went up to Wyoming and worked on the oil drill rigs. Then he moved to Los Angeles and got a job with Bell Telephone, engineering as I said, the first phone lines across the Mojave. But in 1936, he had published a couple of novels. He got the contract to write the biography of William Stratton. So he moves back to Victor, and he lives on and off in Victor and Colorado Springs for a couple of years. And Archie Musick, who was one of the great artists of the period in this city, mentions in his memoir that Waters added substantially to the social life of the artists and writers of Colorado Springs, mainly because of his drinking capacity. But he became very good friends with Frank Michaud, pictured here, and this is his brilliant piece, Tom Kenny Comes Home, from 1944. Archie Musick, of course. Musick writes how when he got the commission to do the mural in Manitou Springs at the post office, Waters wrote this like 2-page letter with, this is what should be on the mural, and he had this big elaborate thing, and then Archie Musick writes, I completely ignored it. So I've got to kind of wrap this up. So in Mora, he was living between here and Mora, New Mexico, and Los Angeles. He was kind of bouncing around. And in Mora, he met Spud Johnson, who was a poet and an editor, who convinced him to move to Taos, New Mexico, where he met Tony Lujan and Mabel Dodge Lujan, who very significantly shaped Waters' writing. And Waters would ultimately settle in to Taos, drawn largely by the landscape. That there's a certain echo there, I think, with Pikes Peak, and of course Taos Pueblo and the Indian culture there. But he always that's his home in Arroyo Seco. He always came back here. He always visited Colorado Springs. I mean, right up almost to his. He died in 1995. And he came here in 93 to accept the first Frank Waters Writing Award. And I think the passage which best gets at the importance of this place to him is from The Dust Within the Rock. The autobiographical character March Cable is standing looking at his father's grave and his grandfather's grave. And Waters writes this. To the west, as far to the north and south as he could see, rose the shining mountains, majestic, enigmatic, and immense. And higher than them all, the lofty whiteness of Pikes' own peak. In the luminous purity of the twilight, he could still distinguish its pale and silvery sheen. Like a religious exile, granted the divine concession of a world to be built at his will, he walked humbly and resolutely toward that imperishable monument of an enduring faith. All right, thank you very much. Should I? Yeah, there we go.
Lillian de la Torre Bueno McCue hits the mark on all three of this year's symposium themes: poet, professor, and provocateur. She was a prolific writer of popular crime stories, plays, poetry, operettas, book reviews, scholarly articles, a cookbook, and any number of blush-worthy limericks. Calling herself a histodetector, she is known as the pioneer of the historical mystery story that solves crimes of long ago using actual historical characters and events. Her most popular stories feature the 18th century literary genius Samuel Johnson as a detective and his biographer, James Boswell. She was a spirited catalyst in Colorado Springs' vibrant mid-20th century culture as writer, actress, singer, gourmet cook, and hostess to the region's progressives. Lillian was born in Manhattan in 1902 to Lillian and Jose Roland de la Torre Bueno, a descendant of Don Juan de la Torre, a Peruvian conquistador. A poet and ardent reader by age 9, Lillian devoured her father's vast collection of history books and detective stories, especially Sherlock Holmes. She was practically born a detective story fan, she said, who could hardly remember a time when she was not addicted. And she made up mysteries with paper doll characters cut from magazine illustrations. Her most treasured was a lady dressed in black with a thick veil, making her perfect for intrigues and conspiracies, and who went through the most mysterious adventures. As a child, Lillian was captivated by and learned old English ballads, instilling in her a lifelong interest in music. Lillian was one of those extraordinarily well-educated ladies of the 1930s. She earned a BA from the College of New Rochelle in 1921, a master's in English literature at Columbia in 27. She mastered Latin, Italian, and French and studied German at the University of Munich in 1928. She earned a master's degree from Radcliffe in English language in 1933 and was admitted as a PhD candidate to Harvard's English department, but attended CU during 1934-35. That's in Boulder, by the way, Brett, Colorado University. Her undergrad college yearbook described her as a budding genius who displayed herself in the rich tone of her splendid voice, in the quality of her literary style, and in the beauty of her poetry. We envy the world that will eventually see her blossom forth into the full flower of a literary light. Lillian's love of English literature, history, detective mysteries, music, and writing would endure throughout her lifetime, and with them, she left a mark on literature and culture. From 1925 through 1934, Lillian taught high school English, where she was recognized as a profound thinker whose outstanding mastery of teaching made her a standout in a faculty of over 300. Following a 9-year courtship, Lillian married George McCue in 1932. They were neighbors who fell in love at first sight, and they were a romantic, literary, fun-loving couple with shared interest in 18th century British history and literature, in travel, in writing, in entertaining family and friends, and in making the world a happy place. George McCue, who was a New Yorker who studied at CU, had lost a lung to tuberculosis, and he resided at Cragmore Sanatorium in Colorado Springs for a time. Following their marriage, McCue announced his intentions to live in the sunny West, likely for his health. They settled in Colorado Springs in 1935, where McCue garnered a position at Colorado College's English department, beginning a 27-year tenure. George was a legendary instructor, renowned a lot for his wit. Once he claimed that to hold his students' attention, he'd dance the can-can on his desk if he needed to. With George earning only $700 for his first teaching semester, Lillian, who had enjoyed a remarkable $3,600 salary near the peak of the Great Depression, cried with rage when she was unable to secure a teaching position. A Depression-era policy allowed only one job to a family, and Lillian's husband, of course, got the job. Over time, she was an instructor at the Colorado College and at UCCS in Colorado Springs. Although she never expected to write mysteries, Lillian had always intended to write, saying that as a student, as a teacher, as a wife, I stocked my mind and kept my pen busy until the day when at 40, I found the thing I wanted to say. A long-standing argument with George about the value of detective stories sparked Lillian's crime-writing career. He considered mysteries a lower literary form, while Lillian argued that a good detective story is a good type form. All it needs is a leading character as solid as, well, as Boswell's Dr. Johnson. With those words, she recalled, the spark came to me that the great philosopher Dr. Johnson was a perfect character. When I heard myself say it, I knew in a flash that the thing was inevitable. Here was a man learned, fearless, penetrating, lovable, full of idiosyncrasy. He lived in an age full of the most extraordinary violence, fraud, and chicane. And he comes with his own ready-made Watson, James Boswell himself, with notebook to record his exploits. That marked the birth of Lillian de la Torre's 50-year career as author of historical crime stories. In 1943, she published the second sight of Dr. Sam Johnson, that tale about the 1784 theft of the Great Seal of England was the first of 33 published Dr. Sam stories, which appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine and were reprinted into a 4-volume book set, which is currently also available in electronic format. Lillian was also a writer-detective, producing true crime novels and plays about famous unsolved historical crimes. Her first crime, published in 1945, was Elizabeth is Missing. It was a tale of a London maidservant who claimed to have been kidnapped and held for almost a month. Described as a naughty story of the days when men were men and women were playthings, it captures the sensibility, flaws, and flavors of its era. She published 3 other true crime novels, including The Truth About Belle Gunness, The True Story of Notorious Serial Killer Hell's Bell in 1955, which was an Edgar Award nominee for Best Fact Crime. It is an account of an immigrant farm woman who murdered between 25 and 30 men for their money and then disappeared. She also wrote 2 biographies of heroic 18th century women for girls. And she also wrote hilarious plays and melodramas. The most ambitious was the Sally Kathleen Claim, or The Gold of Cripple Creek, and you're going to be hearing more about that this afternoon. Among de la Torre's studies, serious crime studies, is a series of 5 plays featuring criminal ladies. The most successful is Goodbye, Miss Lizzie Borden, based on a sensational axe murder of which Lizzie was charged and acquitted of killing her parents because the murder axe was never found. Featuring Lillian as Lizzie, it premiered in Colorado Springs in 1947 to a sold-out audience, requiring a second showing the next night. Retitled The Older Sister, it appeared on Alfred Hitchcock Presents in 1956 and is currently available on old-time radio internet sites. It's a very, very sinister, creepy story, and it happens to feature a woman investigative reporter from Cripple Creek. So she was sort of a booster of the Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek area. Lillian said of her writing, "Time travel is my business." Her books were a trip to days of long ago, the reliving of some thrilling moment of the past. She traveled extensively for pleasure and for the exhaustive research required to solve historical mysteries. After researching a case, she set out to dramatize her solution and present it in believable form. Her Lizzie Borden play, which places the murder axe in the Borden chimney, proved so realistic that it caused a national sensation when a carpenter claimed to have discovered an axe hidden in the chimney of the Borden home, suggesting to Lillian that she was a psychic. Well, when that was proven a hoax, George declared that, well, not a psychic, she was certainly a popular culture influencer. As a scholar-writer, Lillian de la Torre was internationally recognized as an author who published in journals ranging from the Philological Quarterly to the Colorado Magazine, and she earned multiple literary awards for mystery fiction and true crime novels. But in Colorado Springs, where she helped shape the performing arts. She was recognized as Lillian Bueno McCue, a comfortable big woman who had the habit of happiness, warmth for people, and an avid appetite for truth. Lillian was central in the 1936 founding of the Civic Players, currently the Star Bar Players. Ensuring its success, she variously served as usher, publicist, board member, playwright, authoring 12 of the plays, and even sewing costumes. Unable to resist the footlights herself, she appeared in 39 plays from 1937 to 1976. A founding member of the Colorado Springs Chorale in 1956, with her knowledge of languages, Lillian was uniquely qualified to support ambitious musicals. For the chorale, she translated King David from the French, directed the narration, and performed. For the Colorado Springs Opera, she translated Handel's French comedy Circes, that the New York Times proclaimed a clever, tasteful, and imaginative production. As fundraisers for the Thunderbird Music Camp, a children's 2-week summer music conservatory, Lillian composed 3 children's operas and directed the production's narratives. She was a multiple prize winner and active member of the Colorado Springs Poetry Fellowship. In 1982, she published 30 of the hundreds of poems composed over her lifetime, titled Stars and Other Poems. She was a popular speaker. She addressed local, national, and international audiences, including at Johnson's birthplace at Lichfield, England, and in Salzburg, Austria, where a polyglot seminar of lawyers heard her discuss the legalities of the guns case. Regionally, she spoke on a broad range of topics, once keeping the Colorado Authors League spellbound with the hows, whys, and whats of histo detection. At the Colorado Springs Fine Arts Center, she spoke on pornography, the law, and the library. As a couple, the McCues entertained the Friends of the Library with an event advertised as not to be missed, and here it goes. Marshall Sprague will moderate what will surely be a lively and stimulating discussion with Lillian and George McCue. George McCue, philosopher, critic, etymologist, and retired professor, will show slides and comment on modern sculpture. Lillian de la Torre Bueno McCue, noted scholar, researcher, and authoress, will answer questions put to her by Mr. Sprague. This will certainly be an enjoyable and enlightening evening not to be missed. Lillian and George McCue were described by a longtime friend as 2 of the most charming, witty, and generous, wonderful people he had known. They enjoyed a circle of creative friends characterized as radical or progressive. Although serious scholars, the McCues were hilarious and irrelevant. They relished satirizing the social and intellectual worlds, turning them upside down. Lillian wrote of George, "He is a professor when he is on his dignity, but he's so seldom on his dignity." She delighted in his performance art events staged at the train depot to welcome her home from professional trips. Following the publication of her first Dr. Sam collection, he and a life-sized effigy of Johnson greeted her. The most extravagant was a hobo jungle featuring George cooking stew in a tin can over a campfire at the station, dramatizing how miserably he had lived while she was away. The couple staged hilarious Christmas cards. There's George sitting on Santa Claus's lap. There they're shopping the Montgomery Ward's catalog. There's an article in the newspaper that McCue says Merry Christmas. So there were a lot of handmade cards, a lot of detail, and kind of particular attention paid to their private lives and their friends' lives. They founded the University, a club that satirized faculty life with silly costumes, hilarious speeches, and the awarding of honorary degrees. They hosted theme parties, including one with this quirky theme. Please come to a birthday party for George. Please wear a costume suitable for the bathroom. Please bring George a suitable birthday present. one designed to adorn, furnish, or disinfect his bathroom. A prize is offered for the best item for the McCue bathroom bulletin board. Please dispose of this invitation in the usual manner. Regarded as an outstanding chef who cooked with fitful virtuosity, Lillian called herself a psychopathic cook, saying, "When I'm happy, I cook to celebrate, and when I'm blue, I cook to cheer myself up." That resulted in the 60-Minute Chef, a cookbook published in 1947 with her dearest friend, Carol Truax, a renowned impresario and cookbook author. The McCues were deeply committed to civic life, with George making his political ideas public. In the 1930s, he supported the Colorado Springs Unity Council that opposed racial segregation. In the 1940s, he was executive committeeman for the Colorado Socialist Party. A pacifist from World War I, McCue rejected his college president's request for a unanimous faculty vote on adding ROTC to the curriculum. McCue's was the single no vote, for he could not vote against his principles. In the late 1950s, the McCues supported SANE, which you heard about from Rick, the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which was an influential peace group opposed to nuclear weapons testing. He supported the ACLU, and along with Lillian, the American Friends Service Committee. In 1946, and I want you to pay attention to this date, in 1946, McCue reported the civil rights violation of an African-American student who was denied residence in the college dorm. Immediately, the president notified the campus that any fully enrolled citizen at Colorado College would live in a dorm if he or she chose. That was pretty early, actually, in the civil rights advancement. Outside of her many literary awards, Lillian was recognized for her cultural contributions. Asked if she regretted leaving the attractions of New York City, she responded, "I would not have wished to miss the 32 years I spent in the East enjoying New York's artistic activities. But in Colorado Springs from the first, I have been part of such activities." In 1980, the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce presented her with its Medal of Distinction for her contributions to the literary, performing, and visual arts. In 1987, the Colorado College awarded Lillian an honorary doctorate of humane letters, noting that she was a participant in the growth and success of our town's civic theater, chorale, and opera festival, who has been well known on the national scene and an integral part of the artistic and intellectual life of Colorado College for over half a century. She was described as a very great lady, one whose wit, warmth, knowledge, and positive attitude toward life are part of the richness of our lives. Late in life, Lillian remarked that hers had been a sunny life from end to end. She had enjoyed a sunny and beautiful life with many exciting, creative friends, and she spoke of her belief in the restorative quality of creative energy that kept her mind sharp and productive. She said, "You must never stop creating. That's what keeps you alive." After a vibrant and most creative life, the person recognized as responsible for inventing the historical detective story, and the woman who made Colorado Springs' mid-20th century culture vibrant and entertaining, Lillian de la Torre Bueno McCue, died on December 13th, 1993. Among her hundreds of mostly naughty limericks, which are way too racy to share, Lillian penned a tiny biography that can be shared in polite society that grants her the last words on a happy life lived with excitement and joy. "There once was a gal named Lil, who they said was quite over the hill. But there's get up and get in the old girl yet, and living still gives her a thrill." Thank you.
I'm so grateful that I have this opportunity to tell you about Ruth Ashton Nelson. and her Botany Bay located here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. The botanical and travel photographs you'll be seeing today were taken by Ruth, and the botanical specimens you'll be seeing were also collected by Ruth. This is Ruth in her 20s or early 30s. From an early age, Ruth was fond of flowers and being outdoors. She was born in Roxbury, Massachusetts in 1896. In 1905, her family decided to spend the summer out west in Estes Park, Colorado, along the Big Thompson River. The family returned home to Roxbury, and within 2 years, her parents had separated. Her father, Willard Ashton, came back to Estes Park and purchased the Horseshoe Ranch. He would go on to build the Horseshoe Inn in 1908. The property sold in 1915. And today, this property is known as Horseshoe Park in Rocky Mountain National Park. In the mid-1920s, Ruth decided to come back to Colorado and live in the mountains that she loved. She returned to Estes Park and purchased 240 acres of land with a 3-room cabin facing Long's Peak. She named her property Skyland Ranch. Ruth would go on to work as an information clerk for Rocky Mountain National Park for 3 years. When she realized that naturalists had made more money and had a lot more fun than information clerks, she enrolled in the respected Yosemite School of Natural History in California in the summer of 1928. Her goal was to become a paid naturalist at Rocky Mountain National Park, but because of the strong prejudice against women, she was never hired. Ruth then began her master's program at Colorado Agricultural College, which is now Colorado State University. During her master's work, Ruth sought help identifying plants from Rocky Mountain National Park from Dr. Avon Nelson in Laramie, Wyoming. Dr. Nelson was President Emeritus of the University of Wyoming, founder of the Botany Department, and founder of the Rocky Mountain Herbarium at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Nelson, 71, was a widower, was the foremost authority of flora in the Rocky Mountain region, and he found Ruth to be very competent. Their love of botany brought them together, and they were married in 1931. Ruth completed the first comprehensive collection and study of plants at Rocky Mountain National Park for her master's thesis. Her book, Plants of Rocky Mountain National Park, was published in 1933, was based on her master's thesis. The star columbine here on the lower right was collected on June 27, 1963, from plants growing at Skyland Ranch. Ruth noted that they were transplanted about 35 years before. This would have been around the time she purchased Skyland Ranch. In the summer of 1939, Ruth and Dr. Nelson were commissioned with the National Park Service to make a collection of botanical specimens at Mount McKinley National Park in Alaska. With assistance from the park officers, they were able to make extensive collections of some 500 species. The report that followed was filed with the director of the National Park Service. According to the National Park Service, their significant contribution regarding the study of vegetation resulted in the National Park Service identifying hundreds of plants within the park boundaries. Notice the stack of specimens on the ground between Ruth and Avon. You'll see that the botanical paper with the specimens mounted have been stacked between their plant presses. One of the plants identified was botanical specimen 4052. That was discovered by Ruth. Dr. Nelson noted, in her eagerness for the specimens, Mrs. Nelson, amidst snow flurries and in winds of gale-like proportions, ventured upon the slippery rocks when every step threatened to start a slide in the valley. This is botanical specimen number 4052, which would eventually be named Delphinium ruthei. It became known as a type specimen. A type specimen is very important for it becomes the specimen that serves as a reference point when a plant species is first named. This is extremely important to botanists when they are determining the correct application of the name to a specimen. There are several different categories of types, and one of those is a holotype. Holotype is a single type specimen upon which the description and name of a new species is based. Botanical specimen 4052 is also noted as a holotype. This is a copy of a photograph that was published in the Green Thumb magazine in 1961. The Green Thumb magazine was a publication from the Denver Botanic Gardens. This was an important collecting trip that took place at Crater Lake in Colorado in July 1940. The specimens collected on this trip would eventually become held at the herbarium at the Denver Botanical Gardens. The woman at the far left in the back in the hat is Catherine Kalmbach. This is who the herbarium at the Denver Botanical Gardens is named after. I don't know Mrs. Kelso, she's the second woman, but Ruth is in the back with the tie, Dr. Avon Nelson, and then M. Walter Pessman, who is one of the founders of the Green Thumb magazine. Ruth was always in demand on these hiking trips. Not only was she knowledgeable about plants, but she was also knowledgeable about birds. She volunteered at the Denver Botanic Gardens with collecting specimens, planning and working in the gardens, and lecturing. She either wrote or was mentioned in over 50 Green Thumb magazine articles. Ruth and Avon moved to Colorado Springs from Laramie in 1949. Avon had sustained a head injury that required hospitalization, so he was admitted to the Brady Sanitarium. Ruth was friends with Kathleen Marriage, a well-known author, horticulturalist, garden designer, and gardener here in town. Kathleen and Ruth shared a newly built home on West Monroe Street. Kathleen also wrote articles for the Green Thumb magazine. During one of her trips to Europe, Kathleen wrote letters back to Ruth, which were edited and printed in the Green Thumb. One such letter written in 1951 is great. Kathleen writes, "Did I tell you I went last week with a young cousin to the Sadler's Well Theater? Excellent singing, acting, ballet, and everything. Last evening to see Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh in Antony and Cleopatra. Marvelous performance, but the excitement of the evening was when Winston Churchill, with his younger daughter Mary and her husband, came and sat just 2 rows behind us. When people saw him, the whole house stood and clapped." Dr. Avon Nelson passed away on March 35, 1952, here in Colorado Springs. In December, Ruth sent a Christmas greeting and memoriam to Avon. She had written a note on the bottom of the card that I was able to locate. It reads, "Dr. Nelson passed on last March 31st. I plan to remain here. Have built a workshop called Botany Bay on the lot adjoining our home, where I hope to do some botanical work and writing. Don't you ever come west anymore. Best wishes to you both. Love, Ruth." The workshop was approximately 20 feet by 30 feet and made of cinder block. Ruth started living here in 1955, and the workshop was enlarged in 1958, making it more into a home. The botanical specimen in the lower right is a Delphinium nelsoni named after Avon. Ruth collected this on May the 21st, 1953, near Provo, Utah. Here are 2 slides of flowers from Botany Bay. Narcissus and Genthane. The plant name, date, and location are noted on all the slide frames. Ruth literally has hundreds of slides in her collection. Ruth would photograph and study plants in the garden over a period of time. Many of these slides were used in her lectures and on speaking engagements. This is a botanical specimen collected at Botany Bay on May the 25th, 1969. Findlera rupicola. The Findler bush was mentioned several times in magazine articles that Ruth had written and was always included in her photographs. I've been able to track down 3 collected specimens from Botany Bay, along with the specimen descriptions that Ruth made in her field notebooks. One of them is a common weed that still exists today. Penstemon strictus from garden at Bot Bay on June 11th, 1961. This flower is still in the front yard, and the mailbox in the back is still there today. It's still being used. And this is looking to the southeast. In April 1962, Ruth had a 9-page article published in the American Horticultural Magazine, which was titled Horticultural Use of Native Rocky Mountain Plants. Most of the photographs in the article were taken by Ruth at Botany Bay. The same article was published again in 1967. While gardening and writing at Botany Bay, Ruth emphasized work with winter blooms, spring bulbs, native shrubs, and perennials for summer. The photo on the left is looking to the west, and the photo on the right is looking to the northeast. April 1963 daffodils at the East Terrace at Garden at Bot Bay. And it's hard to tell, but in there is a plant marker in the ground. And in looking at all of Ruth's photographs, I have seen photographs where there are different plant markers in all of the gardens, all with different shapes, sizes, and colors. In February 1964, Ruth published an article in Flower and Garden magazine, Pentstemons, Wilderness Treasures That Can Be Tamed. The photograph was taken at Botany Bay by Guy Burgess, a nationally known photographer living here in Colorado Springs. In May 1964, Flower and Garden magazine published an article about Ruth and Botany Bay, Town Garden of a Mountain Botanist. Along with the photographs of Botany Bay, the article included a drawing of the landscaping. The article was written by Lorraine Burgess, a well-known photographer, author, and gardener here in Colorado Springs. These are some photographs from that same article at Botany Bay, Town Garden of a Mountain Botanist. The photo on the left is looking to the south, and the photograph on the right is looking to the west. And again, these same photographs were taken by Guy Burgess. Not only was Ruth a renowned author and botanist, she was a community volunteer here in Colorado Springs. At the demonstration gardens located at Mesa Road and Glen Avenue in Monument Valley Park, Ruth supervised the first collection of native plants in the garden in the 1960s. According to the author Lucien Long, in an article he published in the summer of 1975 in the Green Thumb magazine, he states, "A very presentable garden was started by Ruth Ashton Nelson, noted botanist and author of several very fine books on wildflowers. However, she moved to Estes Park." Ruth sold Botany Bay in June 1964 and returned to Skyland Ranch. While here in Colorado Springs, she taught adult education courses. She also taught classes at the Denver Botanical Gardens and Rocky Mountain National Park. The first class taught on alpine tundra ecology in Rocky Mountain Park was taught by Ruth and Dr. Beatrice Willard in the early 1960s. According to Rocky Mountain National Park, these alpine tundra education initiatives continue today. Ruth was guest speaker at seminars and annual gatherings. She also landscaped the Christian Science Church in town. Ruth traveled throughout the Rocky Mountain region, studying, collecting botanical specimens, and writing. She traveled around the world studying plant life. She lived in Greece for months while setting up a private herbarium at a museum of natural history. And these are some of Ruth's books. They have all been revised and updated over the years, and I'm sure some of you probably have some in your libraries. The Plants of Rocky Mountain National Park has 27 editions. The Bulletin of Wildflowers of Wyoming has 4 editions. Mountain Wildflowers of Colorado has 7. The Handbook of Rocky Mountain Plants has 14. And the Plants of Zion National Park has 4. At Rocky Mountain National Park, she collected from 1927 to 1967. The bulk of their collection came from Ruth. 6,300 specimens are in the collection. 1,272 were collected by Ruth. That's almost 1/5 of the collection. The earliest publication I found referencing Ruth collecting was in the summer of 1931. Ruth Ashton made a collection of mosses she found above timberline on Flat Top Mountain in Rocky Mountain National Park. I recently saw one of these specimens, and they're still green on the moss, 88 years later. The Denver Botanic Gardens has 188 species collected by Ruth and 244 specimens. The Rocky Mountain Herbarium has many specimens collected by both Ruth and Avon. There are 4 botanical species named after Ruth. To have a species named after you is a very big deal. The process takes time, it is long, detailed, and takes a lot of research. The finder cannot name the species themselves. It needs to be named by someone else. As an example, the Cephalmeria ruthae, according to author H. Holmgren in an article published in April 1976 in the book Bretonia, Ruth Ashton Nelson found this rare endemic along a trail where many botanists have passed through the years. We are pleased to use Mrs. Nelson's given name to commemorate the distinctive species. This photograph of Ruth was taken in 1986 at Skyland Ranch. Ruth returned to Colorado Springs sometime in the 1980s and passed away July 4th, 1987. This quote comes from the foreword in The Plants of Zion National Park by Dr. Beatrice Willard. As one who has had the special privilege to walk many trails of Rocky Mountain National Park with Ruth Nelson, I have seen firsthand the close coincidence between the person in real life and the botanist author that shines through the written page. This woman has a deep affection for, devotion to, and comprehension of the land and its diverse plant cover. For her, collecting plants and making observations about their habits and habitats is not a coldly mechanical undertaking. She loves life in all its forms. She has a strong affinity for the land that is life's dwelling place. She expresses profound, quiet reverence for the natural world through everything she says and does. We are all the richer, having known Ruth Ashton Nelson personally and through her writings. Thank you for being here and allowing me to share what I know about Ruth Ashton Nelson's life and what I have learned about Botany Bay in the shadow of Pikes Peak.